Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Schoon. This show is being taped in December 2014. 2015 is right around the corner, literally and proverbially. What I'd like to do in this show, I'm going to attempt to do something that, and I really hope I'm able to do it, but you're the only ones that are going to know whether what I'm attempting to do is successful or not. What I'm going to try and do is explain what's going on right now in terms that you can easily understand. And the topic today has to do with economics. And usually when the idea of economics comes up, the mind sort of goes blank, like mine does during quantum mechanics. And I remember that feeling very well when I was a freshman in high school, and they put up trigonometry tables, trig tables, and my mind went blank. Cosine tables, whatever they were. They went blank at that moment, and they remain blank to this day. Well, I know that many had that reaction when you hear talking about economics. But like economics and religion, there's a lot of opinions. And those opinions sometimes have the truth in them, sometimes they refer to the truth, and sometimes they're there specifically to cover up the truth. And today I want to explain, my attempt is to explain where we are today at the end of 2014 in such a way that what happens in 2015 is going to make sense to you in a way perhaps that didn't happen before. When I speak about economics, I'm referring to the economics that grew up, that came into being after 1694. When the bankers in England, at the Bank of England, introduced debt-based money in the place alongside real money, which was gold and silver, money that had positive value. And why I make that distinction, and why it's going to be very important for you to understand that distinction, because what you call money, pieces of paper like this, wasn't always so. Prior to 1694, money was not this, except for 500 years in China. Paper money first appeared in China, and my description of it there was, it was like Hamburger's helper. The Chinese government started issuing paper currency in place of real money, gold and silver, as an attempt to spend more than what they really actually had. And it worked for a while each time they did it. And when it didn't work, it collapsed the current Chinese dynasty. For the next 500 years, 5 Chinese dynasties tried to extend their spending ability with paper money. And each time each dynasty failed, it ended with the collapse of that specific dynasty. Before the Chinese attempted this in 1024, paper money did not exist. The Chinese invented both paper and ink. I guess it was only natural that eventually some enterprising fool would think, hey, we'll make this money. But it didn't happen that way. It happened because there was a shortage of copper in the presence of Szechuan, and the Chinese decided that they were going to use iron coins in the place of copper. And the iron was so heavy that what the Chinese started doing was, rather than carrying around these sacks of iron coins, they just put them on deposit at coin shops. They would get receipts for these coins, and they would trade these receipts with each other as real money, which they had on deposit at the coin shops. Well, this worked until the coin shops figured out, hey, these receipts are being passed around and you could buy stuff with it, you know, from my coin shop. All right? So they started printing some receipts for themselves and buying the missus and the family and perhaps a vacation or two. And this happened on such a scale that eventually the receipts issued by the coin shops far exceeded the amount of iron coin on deposit, and the whole economy in Sichuan collapsed. Whereupon the central authorities sent down people to see what was going on. They came back and they told them this was what had just happened. And the central authority in China, one of the dynasties, said, hey, this is now illegal, except for us. Coin shops can no longer issue these receipts. Only the government of China, only our current dynasty will issue these receipts. And they started doing the same thing the coin shops did, with the same inevitable result. For the next 500 years, 5 Chinese dynasties tried this with the same amount of success, 0. And by the time the Qing dynasty came along in the 16th century, the Qing dynasty decided we're going to outlaw this abomination. And the only money that was circulating in China at that time wasn't money as we knew it. It was pure silver. The Chinese people on their own, after 500 years of economic chaos, going up and down, up and down, up and down, started melting little balls of silver. And they call these taels, all right? It was an exact amount of silver. And the Chinese used these little silver balls to trade amongst each other for goods and services, reverting back to the first form of money that was not controlled by a government. So in other words, the abomination of paper money put into practice by the dynasty, whatever that was in power in the 11th century, after 5 centuries had failed so miserably, the people took it back upon themselves, cut out the government absolutely, and started trading with each other these little balls of silver, minted in towns and provinces across China with great success. And so for the first time in 500-600 years, the Chinese economy had a stable basis. Now the Qing dynasty at this time realized this, and they didn't want to mess with a thing that happened, a good thing. So they said, no, we're not. In fact, in 1661, they outlawed the printing of paper money. All right, because what the dynasty did, they made their money on taxation, which is all governments do until they get a hold of paper money and take a little clip off of both ends, both from the issuance of money itself and from the taxation upon money. So in 1661, the Chinese, which had invented paper money, issued a law that this was now illegal henceforth. And it would have been good, except in 1694, halfway around the world, unbeknownst to the Chinese, the British bankers, in fact Scottish bankers, approached King William III with a deal that the king could not refuse. And they told William this, you owe all this money because of all these wars you've been fighting, and we'd like to make you a deal. And the king goes, well, what is it? Because he's always had to go to the, quote, bankers, which were the money lenders, to spend on his wars. And he said, what's the deal? And they said, well, if you allow us to print paper conveyances, all right, representing money, we will pay off your war debts. Now, the king was bankrupt at this time, all right, so you could say he was forced into this position. But I don't even think he saw it. He said, well, listen, you guys got all this gold, and I'm the one, I owe my debts to you, and if you're willing to forgive my debts, I'm willing to let you do whatever you want to do. Well, the king never knew what they had up their sleeve, because the original charter of the Bank of England in 1694 did not really grant them the right to print money per se. It granted them the right to print conveyances of debt backed by gold with each other on commercial aspects, all right? But shortly after that, the Bank of England started printing pound notes that were backed by gold that the Bank of England had on demand in their reserves. And these were called reserve notes. Why? Because they were issued by the Bank of England. Now, I want you to understand this, because this is really, really important for every one of you here at the end of the year 2014 as we begin 2015. That money issued by the Bank of England was not a US dollar bill, but it shares with it something that had never been in existence before. The banknotes issued by the Bank of England from 1694 on were in fact conveyances of debt. At the time, they were backed by precious metals, gold and silver, held in reserve by the Bank of England. All right? So they were convertible to precious metals, which had value. But more importantly, they were issued by the central bank, the Bank of England, as a conveyance of debt. Every bill issued from a central bank comes in the form of credit, comes in the form of debt. And once it goes into circulation, once it becomes this, immediately the interest on that debt set by the bank, the central bank, begins ticking. This is called interest. All right? Now, in your wallets, you probably have these. Okay? These. Now, what's the difference? This is sort of like an personal central bank. Okay? If you have one of these, you can go and buy what these give you. And immediately upon purchase, you start owing interest. All right? Time is now ticking. All right? And until you pay that back, every moment that goes by, every minute that goes by, every day that goes by, every year that goes by, you're going to owe more and more money based upon how much you originally took or borrowed. Now, you may have earned this in a salary or by some entrepreneurial activity or by labor. You have earned this. Okay? So interest is not ticking on this specific piece of paper. But because the central banks are constantly printing more and more of these, all right, and they've done so since 1694, the more printing paper money that goes into circulation, the less your specific piece of paper is worth. Do you get that? The more of these that are printed, the less your specific piece of paper, your specific banknote that you are holding is worth. All right? This piece of paper issued, for example, let's say it was issued 50 years ago, and your father went to work and your mother went to work and was paid with this piece of paper, it is worth less now than it was then. Now, you can buy the same amount, let's say if it was a $20 bill, $10 bill, $100 bill. But the truth of the matter is, at that time it was issued, your father and mother could have bought far more goods or services with it than it can now. So even though the denomination is the same, the ability, the purchasing power of that banknote back then was able to purchase more in goods and services than it is today. This depreciation of buying power we call inflation. Inflation means the price of the same goods and services is going up over time. The opposite is, even though the price is going up, this piece of paper, it's able to buy less and less as it gets older and older. All right? Now, what are you aware of? You're not aware of the sinking value of this piece of paper. You're just trying to make a living. The banker, however, is very well aware of it. They were well aware of this in 1694, and they became much more aware of it as time went on. In fact, the longer time went on, the more bankers became aware is the declining value of paper money was in their favor. All right? And what you were forced to do to preserve the buying power of your paper money is you were forced to take this piece of paper or your savings and give it to another party which would invest it in this Ponzi scheme that the bankers had going on called credit and debt, and pay you back more in the future than you were getting if it just sat in your wallet. Now, if this, let's say, $20 bill had been instead a $20 gold piece, it would not have sunk in value over time. The $20 gold piece, up until probably the 19th century, would have stayed, the 20th century, midway through the 20th century, would have stayed at par value. All right? This is what they used to call a banker suit. It is a banker suit. It's made of wool, gabardine, it's pinstripe. All right? And what the bankers used to say is this: an ounce of gold would buy you a fine tailored suit. Didn't matter what time it was. I mean, when we say fine tailored suit, we meant custom tailored, right? Such as this. This is a classic banker suit. It was not only custom tailored for me in 1976, but it was made of the finest English wool worsted that could be purchased at that time, gabardine. All right? John Cooper of London. I don't think the mills exist anymore, but that was what my tailor told me. It was the finest English worsted that was available at that time out of England. Well, so from 1694 to approximately 1920, 1 ounce of gold would have bought you a fine English custom tailored suit for 250 years. Well, what happened? What happened is, eventually, the Bank of England ran out of gold to back its currency. Why? Well, it's quite simple. Why did the Bank of England come into existence? Because the King of England owed all these war debts. What do governments do with their money? Well, they go to war. And if they don't go to war, they buy guns. All right? Everybody hears about how terribly Greece is in terrible trouble. They were the first country in the EU to sink, to be squeezed by dollars, and everybody goes, oh, they were profligate spenders. They spent money they didn't have. Everybody knows about the hairdressers that could retire at the age of 50 without working anymore because of the generous pension plans. But what you don't hear is that the government of Greece had been buying German tanks for decades that they never used. Armaments from the rest of Europe and the world on credit. That's where most of their money went, to buy guns. All right? Military. They never went to war. All right? Most of the armaments bought by today's modern governments aren't used. All right? I guess maybe the United States is trying to make up for that. All right? By putting some of its vast arsenal to work. All right? I mean, here you have countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, wealthiest countries in the world, and they're in debt. Why? I mean, they've just been pumping oil like mad in the last 50, 70 years. Positive cash flow, those people can't eat that much. So they should have huge, vast reserves, all right? But they don't. They owe far more than their income can allow them to spend. Why? Because the West sold them armaments, planes, trained them, put them in debt, and virtually under the control of the West. This is what this is really all about. You as an end user think this is all about spending, paying rent. Why do you think that? Because you're the end user. But the ones who issue these pieces of paper don't look upon this piece of paper like that at all. They look upon this piece of paper or other pieces of paper like this as their passport to wealth and power and financial tyranny. They don't call it tyranny, at least not in public. All right? And I think even in private, they don't like to speak of the vast advantage they wield over the world because of what they did in 1694. All right? Now, this scheme put into place by the British in 1694 enabled the British to go to war on credit, which no other country in the world could do. All right? The only country that opposed them successfully, all right, for the next 150, 200 years was their colonies, the crown colonies in America. In 1776, the crown colonies in the United States went to war against the mother country, England, successfully fought off England's oppression. Now, what was the oppression? Well, you know, they really weren't worse to the American colonists than they were to their own citizens. Not at all. All right? But what had happened is, a long way away from the draconian hand of the arm of the king and the royal family, the Americans began to experience a sense of freedom that the English didn't have themselves. All right? And in fact began issuing their own form of currency because it was quite difficult for the British to keep track of what they were doing over in the colonies. All right? So when the British came in and tried to reassert control and force the Americans to only to use their currency, and let me tell you how important this was. When the British would overrun an Indian tribe, let's say the Iroquois or the Mohawk or whatever, force them into submission with guns to their head, all right? They forced them, and they forced them to sign a treaty, which the Indians, the tribes, would repay them each year. Now, they now owed a tithe to the King of England. That was only could be paid off in pound notes. All right? It wasn't worth it. It wasn't enough that they brought them pelts or gold or silver. They had to bring them and pay them off in pound notes. Why? They wanted to force you to become dependent on these. This is your membership, along with this, in debt servitude. All right? Now, the Americans forced the British to get out of the town. They then had their own little banking system going, which worked until 1913, when the bankers put an amendment in on the, I think it was the 23rd at midnight, 1913, and they passed something called the Federal Reserve Act, which was the first act of privatization in the United States. And the act of privatization, which the government likes to tell you, the Republicans especially, under Ronald Reagan, makes things much more efficient. What it did was, it took a government function which was enjoyed previously by the U.S. Treasury, the printing of gold and silver coins and the issuance of money, only that could be issued in the United States by the U.S. Treasury. They took it over. From 1913 until John F. Kennedy became President of the United States, the U.S. Treasury didn't issue one single dollar. It was privatized by the Federal Reserve. And from that point on, every dollar in the United States, every piece of paper, was a Federal Reserve note, originally backed by gold, and they aren't anymore. You used to be able to tell them, they used to have a red stamp on it, which said you could take this to the Federal Reserve and exchange it for a certain amount of gold. All right? Everyone used to have. That's why Federal Reserve notes were pulled out of circulation. In fact, they passed laws saying, well, the promise doesn't hold anymore. But they were originally all promises to be able to be convertible to gold. Right? Not anymore. Now, these are conveyances of debt in circulation. And as long as they're in circulation, debt and interest is running on them. All right? Now, what does this have to do with you? What does this have to do with you in the year 2014? What it has to do with this. You are living in this world that was transformed by the bankers under the guise of, quote, free markets. Let me assure you, when entrance into a market can only be purchased by the use of a debt-based piece of money, that market is no longer free. In a free market, supply and demand determine price levels. In a capital market, which you've been told is the name for free markets, is not true, it's capitalism, entrance into that market is only through the use of the bankers' debt-based paper banknotes, which put everybody who uses these into debt. So right now, in 2014, you find yourself struggling to pay the debts that you have. Every night that you go to bed, you owe more. This is true whether you're a business, an individual, or a corporation. In the next show, I will bring you up to date. That's the background. And this is the second part of a two-part show. Some of you will see it at one time, where I am at the end of it. This is December 2014. And I want to explain to the viewers in a way that hopefully you'll be able to understand why things are the way they are now in December 2014 and why things are going to be the way they are next year in 2015. And in the last show, I explained about money. I explained how about paper money, which everybody uses now. All right, and this wasn't always so at all. In fact, before the Chinese invented paper money in the year 1000, it didn't even exist on this planet. When Marco Polo was in prison, and when the Venetians were at war with the Genoans, he told this guy about his amazing trip to China with his uncles, and he told them two things that just nobody believed. One is that the Chinese, instead of money, which was gold and silver coins, had writing on pieces of bark, which was what paper was. The Chinese had actually invented paper from the bark. All right, they had ink and they were able to write on it, and because the Kublai Khan, the Mongols at the time, said, "You either used our money or we're going to kill you." Government coercion is very successful, and for all those right-wingers here who think the United States has always been the worst, now just go back to Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan and the Khan boys, all right? And their theory was that you either used our pieces of paper money or you're dead, okay? In fact, what Marco Polo and his uncles had to do when they went to travel to China, they brought gold and silver with them. When they were met at the border, they had to turn in all their gold and silver for these pieces of paper. Not this. This is a later iteration issued by your form of the convoys, all right, the Federal Reserve, or the Bank of England, or the Bank of Japan, or the People's Bank of China, or any central bank on the face of the planet, all right? But in the year 1000, they didn't exist. By the year 1024, they came into being when the Chinese started printing these pieces of paper and calling them money, all right, and putting them into circulation. In the last show, I explained to you that the big difference was between the pieces of paper printed by the Chinese for the first 500 years, from 1024 to approximately the middle of the 16th century, is that the Chinese pieces of paper, quote money, paper money, were merely like hamburger helper. All right, it extended the amount of meat really in the dish. All right, and eventually the Chinese were just putting hamburger helper in instead of meat. All right, why? Because they were running out of money. Governments always spend more than they have the appetite for. Because why? Because governments have no appreciation for money, except to spend it. Why? Because governments don't create money. Money or productivity is created by labor or ingenuity. All right, that's it. Governments spend money, which they get by either taxation or now, because of 1694, what happened in Britain, the central banks and the governments are now one. All right, and they have colluded to force these pieces of paper upon their citizenry. All right, where now everybody is a debt citizen, because you're either using this or another form of this paper banknote or credit cards. All right, now I know people are trying to substitute bitcoins and gold and silver. Good luck. All right, this has got to fall before any new system comes in. And in this show, I want to give you some hope. The 300-year scheme put in place by the Bank of England is nearing its end. Why? Extraordinary scheme. Extraordinary. It moved all around the world through the British Empire. All right. What the British called free trade was basically, if you're not using their money, they came up with guns, blew you out of the water, and when they left part of their navy there and their money, which you had to use, or you had to give them in equal amount, gold and silver, to keep your game going. The British were able to do this with the one exception of the United States. In 1776, the American colonies revolted and refused to allow any central bank in until, well, there was one called the Bank of the United States, which was thrown out by President Andrew Jackson. And later, as I said before in the previous program, in the middle of the night, on December 23rd, with barely a quorum, the United States Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, which allowed the United States Federal Reserve Bank, it's not even the United States, it's just the Federal Reserve Bank, to privately issue the currency of the United States. Okay? From 1913 until 1965, 63, maybe 64, the U.S. Treasury did not issue one denomination of any bill. All right? For 50 years. Something happened. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy issued $20 million from the U.S. Treasury, backed by silver. This was the first piece of paper money issued by the U.S. government that was not debt-based, that interest did not immediately begin running on, indebting whoever used it, in the people of the United States, basically, because it's all issued through the central banks. All right, everybody's basically beholden, whether you're a citizen or an anarchist or an entrepreneur, or labor. All right, and even a believer in free markets. All right, you're liable for those debts. All right, and from 1913 until 1963, the United States government, which was the only country to actually successfully revolt against the tyranny of the bankers' paper banknotes, was taken over in a first act of privatization, a term made popular by the Republicans of Ronald Reagan. But in truth, the first act of privatization was really the co-opting of the U.S. currency by the Federal Reserve in 1913. All right? What happened in 1963? Well, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy, by executive order, issued $20 million in silver-backed currency from the U.S. Treasury. Within the year, John F. Kennedy was dead. It's no accident. And the following year, his successor, William Baines Johnson, recalled every one of those $20 million $20 notes, and they sold the entire silver reserves on the open market of the U.S. Treasury. The bankers were going to make sure the United States never did this again. And we haven't. And we will not until another version of the United States arises on the ashes of the old. What you don't realize, I mean, some of you do realize, and I understand why you don't realize it, is how powerful this piece of paper is. How powerful this credit card is. But not to you, but to those who issue it. Those who issue debt-based paper money and issue credit own the system. They own the game. And it is a game at which you are at a distinct disadvantage. Now, to those of you who have been nimble enough and quick enough and lucky enough to stay ahead of the game, you have a great deal of affection and respect for the system called capitalism. For the countries and for the individuals who've been crushed by this very unequal playing field, Russia, China, and not only were they crushed, that the communists, which took power so they didn't have to undergo the scalpel of capitalism, turned the system of communism on their own citizens and screwed them worse, perhaps, than the Westerners would have done, than the bankers would have done. The bankers wanted to keep their economies functioning so they could pay the taxes. The economies of Communist China and Communist Russia had no viable tax base, were absolutely unequal, impossible to stand up to the prevarications of the West, which was first only England, then joined by Germany, France, all those Western countries, which later included the United States, and they took domicile in China, all right, under the guise of free markets. Well, what did free markets really mean? They were markets where you had to use the West paper money, which gave them a distinct advantage over everybody else. Once you accepted the West paper money, debt-based paper money, which they printed ad infinitum, except for the constraint of gold, except for the constraint of gold. The Western nations could print, that had central banks, could print as much money as they wanted to buy up the goods and services of the rest of the world, whereby it was oil, lumber, minerals, gold and silver, aluminum, iron, coal. It didn't matter. The West had the singular advantage of being able to buy and oppress other nations that they forced to use their paper money. And this happened for up until the 20th century, when the World War II got so expensive, the cost was so huge that, first of all, England, which is the granddaddy or the mother of this abomination of paper money, and the first real recipient of its great gifts, which was tyranny, imperial tyranny, went bankrupt, whereupon taken over by the United States. Now, what happened in the United States in the 1930s is very important for you who are watching this program now in either December 2014 or 2015 or whenever you're going to watch it. All right? I've been talking on this subject since 2008. All right? In March 2007, I delivered a paper before a closed network, and I predicted that the world economy was going to absolutely go collapse into a depression worse than the Great Depression. And I still stand by that. All right? We had a huge crisis within a year and a half of my making the prediction. There's been a partial recovery, only because that the central bank started printing money like it was going out of style, and it truly is going out of style. And you've had a partial recovery, all right, by the December of 2014. But in this last month of 2014, everybody's getting worried, even the bankers themselves, because this burst of new money printing didn't do what they needed to get done. Now, what did they need to get done? Let me explain to you, hopefully in terms that you can understand. I explained to you that the issuance of money, okay, and or credit results in debt. All right? In central banking, every dollar issued, every denomination issued is issued in the form of debt that immediately starts demanding interest be paid on that. All right? This was true until 1963, when Kennedy issued $20 million by executive order of dollars from the Treasury, the first time in 50 years the U.S. Treasury had done so, of money backed by gold or by silver. All right? 1 year later, Kennedy was dead. 1 year later, every bill was recalled. 1 year later, every ounce of silver was sold out of the U.S. Treasury. All right? This is not by accident. And the fact that you don't know it is not by accident either. And it's not that it's not important. It is far more important for you to understand it, and that's the reason why you don't know. All right? Now, let me explain to you. Every one of those debt conveyances go into circulation and interest must be paid. All right? Now, how does it get paid? There must be enough economic growth sufficient to pay down the constantly compounding debt set in motion by the issuance of debt-based money and or credit in any of its various forms. All right? So in other words, you have the need of a constant expansion of the economic base. Why? Because if you imagine that capitalist economies, they're fed by credit coming into the system, all right? Every dollar, every denomination, whether it's a yuan or whether it's a ruble or what it comes out in the form of credit, it creates the equal amount of debt, all right? But what happens? That amount of debt, 1 to 1, $1 of credit, $1 of debt, soon becomes imbalanced. Why? Because the debt that dollar has turned into, or the denomination turned into, starts compounding interestly, demanding interest payments. $1 of credit turns into $1 of debt that immediately begins rising in aggregate value. Why? Because interest is being charged on that debt. Do you understand what I'm saying? If $1 billion goes into circulation, issued by a central bank, the $1 billion in credit turns instantly into $1 billion of debt, upon which interest becomes due and payable each instant. And every moment that that debt either exists and or is not retired, it grows in volume and in size. This has been going on since 1694. It stopped in the 1930s when the aggregate amount of debt was so huge that it collapsed not only the economy of the United States, but basically the world, and their scheme of the circulation of credit and debt failed. And it stopped. All right? We have now reached the point where, I'm going to show you this. This is the amount of money in circulation in the United States. All right? It has to stay in some sort of parity. It has to keep circulating. It's like blood pressure. The blood pressure has to keep going at a certain rate, or the patient's going to die. Now, what you see happening here is it goes up and down, up and down, up and down with the amount of the growth of the economy, the amount of money in circulation, which is called M2. Where it reaches its high point, which is here, is in 1998. As this was 1995 when the dot-com bubble started. So from here up to here, it started exploding. The blood pressure started exploding. It blew up, and ever since then, it's been going down. Down. This is where we are today, except we're down here. We're further. All right? Which means in 2015, the amount of money or debt in circulation, the velocity is slowing. Velocity is slowing. And in the system created by the bankers, the velocity of money has to either stay constant or increase. So when you're hearing about deflation in the EU, you're hearing about deflation, the fears of deflation in Japan, all right? You're hearing about a slowing economy in China and a barely functioning economy in the United States that's, quote, still expanding because they've had the greatest influx of printing money that has ever happened except for China. After the collapse of 2008, the bankers' scheme started nosediving. The circulation of credit and debt is slowing. And like a bicycle, capitalism doesn't do well at slow speeds. So for those of you who are watching this program, whoever you are, wherever you are, whether you're in China, whether you're in Japan and South America, it doesn't really matter because you are all affected by this, by the amount of circulating credit and debt in this scheme that was imposed upon the world by the bankers, by which the bankers achieved great wealth, by which their collusion and crime, the governments achieved great power, so much wealth and so much power, leaving none to the rest of us, that it's collapsing in and on of itself. Their game is almost over. And I know that all of you are worried about it. What will I do? What is going to happen to me tomorrow? Well, I sort of see this as like the folks on the slavery plantation saying, if Massa doesn't get the refi in London from the bankers, the plantation's going to go all to hell, and what will we do? Well, I know you're all worried about it. House slaves, you know, the ones who skimmed off the top, the ones who made it their way out of the cotton fields, so you've got a little shack that you owe plenty of money on. I know you're worried about it. I understand. But you know what? I came of age in the 60s, which was probably the biggest revolt against materialism this world has ever seen. The hippies. And you know what? This hippie is in a banker suit, December 2014. And I want to tell you, what created this suit is coming to an end. And it's going to happen in its own time. Nobody's going to have to revolt against it. Nobody's going to have to kill anyone to end the system. The light is going to return. Love is going to replace the selfishness and greed and warfare that has been on this planet. And I know most of you don't believe it. And I don't expect you to. Most of you didn't believe it when I said in 2007 that the world economy was going to go into the toilet. And it did the next year. And the ensuing 6 years, it has had a partial recovery. But it's only a partial recovery. It only set in motion a greater response by the central bankers to save a scheme that cannot be saved. The Japanese are already in extremis. Europe is going in next. It is going to be followed eventually by the United States and China. Why? Why is this inevitable? Because we have built a world economy on the shifting sands of credit and debt that have now reached such an aggregate amount that it is collapsing of its own accord. No matter how much new money they print, no matter how cheap the credit they infuse into the system, they cannot create enough aggregate growth to take care of the aggregate levels of debt that previous infusions of credit have created. Game over. All right? And I know most of you see this as a tragic event. I want to leave you with the thought that it is not tragic at all. That this event that is about to take place around the whole globe is our salvation. All right? What happened with this game was that in 1930s it already stopped and was brought to a standstill. All right? What happened to all that debt was that World War II came along, wiped out all that debt, and the United States had a huge amount of gold in 1949, which formed its basis of a new infusion of credit for the rest of the world, and we were given an extension. Well, we've run out of that extension. All right? By 1971, most of that gold was gone. Where did it go? The United States had a positive balance of trade with the rest of the world. So you would expect that we should have even more gold in 1971 than we had in 1949. 1949, we had 21,775 tons of gold. All right? In 1971, when Nixon shut the gold window, officially we had, I think, 7,000 to 8,000 tons left, but that was pure made-up numbers. The United States had not allowed an auditing of its gold reserves since 1954. It is my suspicion that the United States has no gold left, at least not gold that's not encumbered by the demands of another nation. 2 years ago, the Germans asked the United States for their gold back. We gave them a pittance and said, well, we'll give you gold back over the next 20 years. Let's say you had loaned your neighbor a bunch of money 20 years ago. And he said, you can have it back anytime you want. I've got it in my cellar. And then you went over and said, hey, Bill, I want my money back. And he said, well, if it's all right if I give you a little bit now and a little bit later over the next 20 years. You would immediately become suspicious. All right? But because the bankers in Germany, the bankers in the United States, the bankers in Japan, and some of the bankers in Russia and in China are part of the same Ponzi scheme, they're all staying real quiet about what's going on. But for the rest of us, whether you're a business person or you're a person who has a job and you can't find another job, or a young person growing up finding out that the opportunities of yesterday are literally that, the opportunities of yesterday. You're walking into a world that is forever changed. It just hasn't caught up with its end yet. All right? What is going to succeed this Ponzi scheme that the bankers put in place in 1694 that is spread all over the world? I don't know. I have no idea what is going to take its place. But I know the basis of that, whatever capes up, is going to be in contradistinction to the credit and debt introduced by the bankers. All right? Who have single-handedly benefited by the indebting of everyone else. Better times are ahead. I end all my articles with the words, buy gold, buy silver, have faith. And of these three, faith is the hardest to come by and the most precious.